Morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute to let everybody get signed in, and we'll be with you in a moment. In the meantime, I am going to drop in the chat box the presentation that you can download, and I'll do that throughout the session. So don't worry if you miss it. Just give it another second.
Are you going to drop those in now, Denise?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started right now. Thanks for joining the Ethos Human Capital Solutions webinar today, entitled, we have two different titles for this, but we all know it's about Form I-9, mastering the form because the deadlines are coming up. So my name is Denise Keddy, and I'm your moderator this morning. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before I introduce our panel for today. Our webinar usually runs about 55 to 60 minutes so that we can save some time for a Q&A at the end of the session. Don't worry if you need to leave before the webinar is over. We will post it on the Ethos YouTube channel, and I know that it will also be posted on the Merhab Robinson Clarkson YouTube channel too. The link to the handout is listed in the slide. Well, actually, the link to the handout is listed in the chat, and I will continually put it through the into the chat if you don't get it right now. Linda, are you advancing? Because I don't see anything.
I can. There you go.
Okay, there you go. All right, now we're going. Okay, so if you have any questions during the presentation, you can post them into the Q&A section. If you want a specific person to answer it, please include that information. We'll do our best to answer all your questions. If you have any issues during the presentation, just drop a note in the Q&A area, and I will try to get back to you and solve your problem when we can. Just a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and all accompanying materials are protected by copyright. The presentation today is intended for information only and should not be relied on as a conclusion in any area of law. The information offered is as of today, July 20th, 2023. And we always recommend that you consult your specific legal counsel or HR experts with your questions, because they have the most current information and knowledge on what's happening. For those of you who are looking for HI certification, if you want credit for today, type it into the questions section. I think you will get a survey afterwards. You'll see a follow-up email. Once it's completed, you'll be able to download your certificate. So make sure you look for the survey afterwards. Let me introduce you to our expert panel today. Our expert lawyer on today's session is Curtis Ryan. Curtis is an associate at Merhab Robinson and Clarkson in the firm's transactional department, where he advises clients on real estate, finance, and employment law. In addition to all his outstanding work, Curtis contributes articles in law journals and lectures, and at business and politics, at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Curtis has continually been recognized as a rising star by superlawyers.com for the years 2017 through 2023.
Whoop, whoop.
Yep, and I don't know how he has the time to do all that because he has got kids. So Linda Duffy is the founder and president of Ethos Human Capital Solutions, and Linda is known as the people problem solver. Linda and her team are known for building the magic of the human connection with their consulting, recruiting, and organizational development programs. Linda and the Ethos team work with your company by developing strategies for business leaders to get the right systems, people, and culture in place within your organization so that you as a business owner can focus on running your business and achieving your goals. Her clients range from high-tech businesses to manufacturing firms to nonprofit organizations, and Linda is extremely well-versed in addressing the concerns of founder, CEO-led businesses. And Linda, would you do us a favor and introduce our special guest speaker for today?
Yes, with pleasure. It's my pleasure to introduce Nicole Martinez. Nicole has been with Ethos for about almost 3 years now, coming up on 3 years. She is our lead HR specialist. So for those clients on the call, you've probably already dealt with Nicole or somebody on her team because they handle all of the onboarding of new employees, making sure everybody gets signed up for benefits. They handle separations, all of those different things. She's also, I think her title is like Intergalactic Queen of Zendesk, which is our ticketing system. And so she manages that too to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. And she has a great deal of experience because not only with all of the onboarding that she does for our clients, but she's been involved in some major I-9 audits that we've undertaken over the last several years. So she is definitely our subject matter expert. And as it says on her bio slide, if she's not doing that, she plays with her dog Remy. And she also, even though she wasn't even born yet, loves 80s music. So Nicole, thanks for joining us today. We're
Thank you,
really
Linda.
happy for you to be here. So our agenda is really simple. We're going to just give you a little bit of history about what's going on now. This is specific to the changes again in the Form I-9 laws. We're going to go through some examples of how you should be notating the Form I-9s. This is specific again to the end of COVID. We're going to go through a lot of what ifs because that's probably why a lot of you joined us today is, what if this happens? What if that happens? We're going to go through that. And then we're going to also tell you some of the options you have, going forward in terms of remote employees and how you can verify their documents and do that page 2 certification, give you some next steps, talk then about common mistakes that we see, and Curtis will tell us all about those penalties, and then we'll talk a little bit about the future. And again, as Denise mentioned, we always try to save room for questions at the end. So Curtis, I think it's important for everybody to understand the players involved, right? Because we see so many different abbreviations all the time. So can you just walk us through the different branches of Department of Homeland Security and what they do relative to I-9 forms?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, any kind of government compliance is going to be done through the Department of Homeland Security. The three main departments or agencies or divisions within DHS that will want to take a look at your I-9s or make sure that you're preparing your I-9s and ensuring eligibility of employees to work in the United States. First one we have mentioned here is Homeland Security Investigations. It's the investigative arm of the DHS. That's the group that actually performs inspections of Form I-9s that can show up at any time to your office, and you have to show them your Form 9s and they get to take a look at them. ICE stands for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is the enforcement arm of DHS. And then there is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. This is the department that evaluates persons' eligibility for citizenship, visas, etc.
Yeah, and USCIS is the website we always go to because they have all the best information. That's where you can download Form I-9s, and they have a lot of FAQs on their website. So that's a great website to go to as well. Curtis, when we talk about sort of the laws regarding Form I-9s back in March, why don't you tell everybody sort of what happened, and then we'll talk about what changed this year.
Well, we'll roll back the clocks all the way back to March of 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic started. And even before that, so the law was that an employer was required to verify an employee's eligibility to work in the United States. An employer was required to do that using the Form I-9. And the first page of the Form I-9 is filled out by the employee, and the second page of the Form I-9 is filled out by the employer. And when the employer fills out the second page of the Form I-9, the employer is supposed to physically review and verify or physically inspect an employee's identification documents, such as a driver's license, social security card, passport, permanent resident card, whatever the employee has. When COVID-19 started and large portions of the workforce moved to working remotely, the law was temporarily changed, or at least there were temporary emergency regulations that allowed for employees who worked remotely due to COVID to have their eligibility verified remotely instead of in person through physical inspections. So that was the initial emergency rule that was issued in March of 2020. It was extended a number of times, but it's not going to be extended anymore.
A bummer
So
for sure.
yeah. So now there can be no more remote inspections, no more remote verifications of I-9s of eligibility to work in the United States, and any I-9 or any eligibility that was verified remotely during the pandemic must be physically inspected now. In other words, if if I was hired during the pandemic and I emailed over a copy of my driver's license and social security card, I must now physically provide my driver's license and social security card so that my employer can do a physical inspection and verification for me and anyone else that was hired remotely or hired to do remote work during the pandemic.
Yeah, so on May 5th, that's when they announced this change to sort of revert back to how it had been before. You have until August 30th, because it's 30 days after the end date, which was July 31st. So you have 30 days before they're going to start knocking on your door and asking questions. So time is now, right? It's really important that you start making those changes to the forms. So let's go through some examples of, first of all, what that form should have looked like if you did remote verification before. Nicole, welcome. And do you want to walk us through?
Of course. Thanks, Linda. So when DHS did start allowing for the remote inspection, they did give us instructions of how to properly notate the form at that time, which included leaving a note in the additional information box, such as the example we have here. So within this example, you would just have to notate that the remote inspection was indeed completed at on such and such date. So for this here, it says remote inspection completed on 3/30/2020. Just any sort of note. This is an example that we have, but any sort of note just to show that the inspection was indeed completed to continue on moving with the I-9 form, specifically in section 2.
Great. So let's say that now you go back to do the physical inspection, and in this example, Abigail Adams was the person certifying page 2. Abigail Adams is going to now physically inspect the documents. What do they do?
So in this case, where the physical inspection is completed by the same person this time around, Abigail Adams would just have to leave a note just to say that specifically. So the example we have here shows that the COVID-19 documents were physically examined or inspected on the corresponding date. And since Abigail Adams is the same person who verified and inspected the documents remotely and will be doing so physically, she just has to initial put her initials within here. So that's why it shows AA for this example.
Okay, but if it's a different person, because people move on, right? Or again, because this is remote, so this is going to make it difficult for people to do the physical inspection. If it's somebody else, how do they notate that?
So in this case, where a person it is a different person who verified and inspected them remotely versus physically, we still have a note to leave within the additional information box in section 2, which is just still stating that the documents were physically inspected on the date, but we have to add a little bit more information, which would include the person's full name and title to show that this was a completely different person, but the inspection was indeed completed.
Great. Okay, so those are the basics in terms of how you need to notate the forms. And again, you always want to make notes in the additional information box. They do not like any additional information written any place other than in this box, right? So you fill out the form. If you need to notate something, that's where it goes. So let's go through some of the what ifs, Nicole, because this is probably, again, where most people are going to, have question marks, right? Different situations come up. So, Curtis mentioned in his example, the person would bring in you know, the driver's license and social security card, but what if the employee presents different documents? Is that okay?
Yes, that is totally okay. So the person can present different documents, especially since the beginning of the pandemic was about 3 years ago. So if they certainly don't have the same documents, they can present different ones. So in this case, we do have two options where you can kind of approach this. So the first option, which we consider as best practice, is just to complete a new section 2 on the I-9 form that will be able to capture the new document information and put in the inspector's information and signature on a new section 2. Then you would just attach that new section 2 with the original I-9 form that was used at the time of the remote inspection. This tends to be best practice because if we look at the other option, which is still working off of the section 2 that was completed at the time of the remote inspection, but instead of completing a new section 2, you would try to fit the document title, number, issuing authority, expiration date, all of the information within that additional information box, which can be a little bit crowded
Really
and it might
crowded.
be right, and it might be a little bit difficult to read. So if you don't want to go that route, then just completing a new section 2 for the form is suggested.
Yeah, so just take a new page 2 and fill it out. Just keep in mind, you never want to destroy the original. So you're going to attach it on top of the original form that was completed. So now you have a 3-page form in essence, instead of just the normal 2-page form. So let's talk about what happens if the document was valid at the time and now it's expired. That's fine. You don't need to worry about that. You can still go ahead and inspect it as long as it was unexpired at the time that it was originally done. It doesn't matter if it's since expired. You can still use that document. You're going to do the same thing that Nicole just advised, which is you're going to go through and, you know, complete a new page 2 in our, you know, that would be our recommendation, put a new page 2. And if you're the same person, again, you just have to, you know, well, if you're going to fill it out, you're going to fill out the whole form. If you want to go ahead and do it in the information box, you're just going to include your initials and the date when it was inspected and then write the new information in. I'm with Nicole on that one. It's going to be way too crowded. Now, the one exception is if the employee's authorization to work expired during this time, then you're going to have to notate that in the additional information box, and you can use section 3 to re-verify, or you can just do a whole new page 2 depending on the situation. The most important thing is they do not want to see any gaps in terms of authorization to work in the United States. So let's say somebody, for example, had a permanent residence card and has since become a US citizen. They're not going to be able to present you the permanent resident card. They're not going to have it anymore. So now they're going to have to give you new documents. So you would do the same thing. You can, you know, use section 3 to re-verify, or you can fill out a new page 2 and take care of it that way. So Nicole, people move on. What happens if the person's gone? Do they have to go track them down, hire a private investigator?
No, they do not. So your job gets a little bit easier in the fact that if the person is no longer working for your company, we just have to make sure that the proper notes are left on the documents. So in this case, you would still leave a note within the additional information box in that section 2 of the I-9 form to state that exactly. So in our example here, we just have the verbiage of COVID-19 physical inspection cannot be completed or cannot occur because the employee separated on whichever date. After you leave that specific note to explain why the inspection cannot be completed, it's important to either, if you are the same person who completed the remote inspection and the physical inspection, you would leave your initials. But if you're a different person who completed the physical inspection, again, you would just put your name, similar to how you had to do it previously.
Awesome. And then we talked about what if the employee's immigration status changed, right? So again, just complete a new section 2. That would be the best practice. Just do the same thing that we've been talking about. If you can use section 3 to re-verify, that's another option as well. So what happens, Nicole, and maybe Curtis, you can jump in on this too. What happens if an employee says, I'm not bringing the documents?
So I can comment on this. The DHS is very clear on what the rules are if this happens. In other words, the employee cannot continue working if the physical inspection cannot be completed. And as a result would be grounds for termination. It's not the best outcome that maybe everyone likes to hear, but at the end of the day, this is a process to verify the person's eligibility to work, which includes their identity and authorization. So it has to be completed as just basic requirements of the I-9 form.
Yeah. So what happens if a company uses E-Verify? How does that change any of this?
So with E-Verify in the picture, this wouldn't necessarily change the rules that and instructions we've been given for completing the inspection. We still have to do that within the I-9 form, the section 2, whichever the case is for each employee who presents their documents. So we still have to provide and follow through with the inspection and updating the form. However, with E-Verify, you do not need to submit a whole other case for that employee if one was originally done at the time of hire.
Yes, in fact, they tell you specifically not to create a new case for the worker.
Yes.
It's just going to double up everybody's workload there. Okay, so what happens if we destroyed the original paper form and then, since then we've scanned it, or maybe like for a lot of our clients, they do it electronically through a payroll system, something like that. How will people make these changes?
Well, we've had to kind of adapt and see what possibilities we have and what options we have to make sure that these changes are captured and tied to the original documents. So with our team, we've actually been practicing a lot with just utilizing electronic files. So if your PDF software allows you to leave notes on an existing file, you can do it that way and leaving notes there. Or you can use a new section 2 of the PDF, use that to digitally complete it and then and combine it with the original PDF. Or if all else fails and the software doesn't work as you want it to, you can always just print out the I-9 form for section 2, complete it as such, and then rescan it to be attached to the original I-9. Now, a good thing to keep in mind is a lot of HRIS systems and payroll providers out there actually have the I-9 embedded within their new hire paperwork and within the onboarding process. So it is good to check with them to see if there's any sort of way where you can access the original I-9s to leave notes, or if there's a way where you may have to go back to square one and print it out and rescan it to upload.
Right. And there's probably other options out there we haven't thought of, but those are the ones that our team's been using the most.
Mhm.
So this is a bummer. A lot of companies are going to be remaining remote or going to have remote employees. So what happens now?
So unfortunately, this will still apply to those companies set up. The physical inspection has to still be completed. And so there's no going around it, unfortunately, but we have some options where you can help coordinate this, which we'll review later.
All right, great. And then what happens if we can't find a form? What do we do? Because this happens, right? We lose them sometimes.
It does, it happens. So the best the best suggestion would be just to complete one as soon as possible. It is better to have one on file than none in case of an audit. So it is important just to have one completed if you absolutely cannot locate or find the form. But with that, you will have to just again provide an explanation or the documentation to show why this is the case. So we recommend leaving just any sort of note to explain what happens and just attaching it to the original or the new form. As Linda mentioned earlier, they are looking for continuity, so it's important to provide as many details as you can to explain maybe the discrepancy gap in the dates or anything where they may question why it was completed after the fact.
Curtis, what do you usually recommend to clients other than get one done as soon as possible? You have them attach a memo like that?
That's exactly what I have. What I recommend. If it's lost, can't be found, do a new one and have an explanation of why there is a new one.
Great. Okay, so Nicole, we mentioned that there's some remote verification options, right? Because this is going to be a burden on people, especially if the employees are remaining remote. So let's go through some of these options, what your team's been doing, what we're advising clients to be doing. You know, obviously the first one is you can go to the employer, bring the employee to you, right? But that could be, that could be financially, not feasible depending on where the employee is and where you're located, right? What else? What are the other options?
Right. So if that option does not work, the other option that we are presented to use is to designate someone to act as an authorized representative on behalf of your company to assist with the I-9 process for Section 2. And this is where it gets a little interesting because the DHS provides very flexible rules in terms of who this can be, which is quite interesting to me at least. But with that said, the authorized representative or designated agent, those terms can be used interchangeable. I've seen both in my experience, but this can be anyone really who is willing and able to complete the physical inspection and complete Section 2 for um, for the company. So this can be a neighbor, spouse, friend, roommate, your mailman if you want to, anyone who the employee obviously would feel comfortable showing their documents to, completing that physical inspection to do as such. In my experience, we've also seen some go to notaries to have this inspection and Section 2 completed. It is important to note, though, that for notaries, a notary can complete the form. However, they cannot provide that notary stamp or seal as probably in their normal process to on the form. So the I-9 itself cannot have any sort of notary stamp with it.
Yeah, and I think what's really important is that the person that you designate, you make sure that you train them or you help them fill out the form correctly because you're still liable for any mistakes that they make. So that's what's really important to me. Now, Curtis, have you seen anything that would, because we can't find anything that would prevent, say, Nicole from completing page 2, except for, the signature part, right? And then having the designated person physically inspect the documents and then sign it. Is there anything that says that the person that is going to sign it must fill out the form? Because we haven't seen that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I like same like you. I haven't seen anything that would prohibit it.
Yeah.
I just get nervous when there's an authorized representative or designated person, just because, like you said, and we have here on the slide, the company's still liable for any mistakes.
Right.
I get nervous when we're asking somebody 10 states over to review the physical documents on the company's behalf.
Yeah, we do too. So that's why, we're doing a lot of training of managers right now. But if, there's somebody in Wyoming and there's no company around, there's not going to be a lot of options again, unless you're going to go to the employer, have the employee come to you, right? So using a designated person is going to be less expensive, but they're not going to probably be used to this form, right? Know how to complete it. And we're going to talk about some of the common mistakes that we see. So just be careful and make sure that you're reviewing it. And I think it's okay to have, the knowledgeable person, right? Your HR person, your manager, whoever it is, fill out the form, just they can't sign it, right? So as long as the designated person is okay signing a form that somebody else completed, I think you're okay. We have not found anything, any place, and we've looked that suggests that you can't do it that way. Now, there's one other option, and we've done some investigation and we did find some third-party services are starting to pop up. This is just one example. It's not a recommendation. We just wanted to let people know that there are third-party services out there. So this is Equifax. You can go to that link if you want and check it out. But I can just tell you, like, they have the recommended one. A lot of our clients are smaller than that. So the first one on the left says ideal for under 100 employees. Just note, you have to give some thought to how many people you're going to be hiring, because this is $72 a month, just like the ticket to play, right? It's a subscription service. So it would be on an annual basis, that's already $864. And then there's a per employee cost of like $95, I think, for this particular service. So that's cheaper than a plane ticket for sure. If you're going to be hiring a lot of people, then this might be something. I don't know how many offices they have or where they're located. So you'll have to investigate all that, but at least there are other options out there like third-party services. So let's talk about next steps and what we suggest people, do from here. So the first thing you're going to want to do is go back and compile a list of all of your employees that were hired during COVID-19, since March 20th, and figure out of those employees, who did you remotely verify their forms? Hopefully, again, you already documented that in that information box, that additional info box to say remotely verified, but in case you didn't, you're going to have to use your best guess, right? And take a look at that, notify them and say, hey, we have this new requirement. We would suggest sending them the list at page 3 that has a list of the acceptable documents. You can, of course, remind them of what they used originally, but they do have the option of presenting any responsive documents now that are unexpired if they're newly presenting, and then make arrangements for that physical inspection, whether you're going to do it, a third party, whoever's going to do it. Just make sure that those people have been trained. A few important reminders: do not have employees fill out a new Form I-9. We see this happen a lot. We see it happen when a new I-9 form comes out. So like the one everyone's using right now actually expired last October. They haven't revised it yet, but we're still using that. When the new form comes out, when you go through this update, you do not have them fill out a new page 1. All we're doing is the physical inspection and the recertification on page 2. As a general reminder, keep your Form I-9 separate from the employee files. And the reason we advise that, that's what they recommend, but you don't want to help them out. So if DHS does show up, or HSI does show up, knock on the door and say, hey, we're here to fill out, here to do an audit, and you turn over your employee files, if they see anything in there that causes alarm, it's easy for them to notify one of their sister agencies that now shows up, and vice versa is true. Department of Labor walks in, or, somebody walks in from state of California and looks at your employee files. You don't want them tipping off anybody if they see mistakes on Form I-9s. And then make sure all changes, again, are explained in that additional information box, right? And here's the other really big tip: purge any terminated forms as soon as possible. This is just a general rule for Form I-9s, not specific to what we're doing now, but it's a good opportunity to purge any terminated forms. It's less, one less thing you have to do in terms of, updating anything, but also it's just one less opportunity for them to fine you, right? If they come in and see a mistake. And Curtis is going to talk about that in a little bit. So the general rule for shredding I-9s, or however you want to take care of it, is you have to keep them the greater of 3 years total or 1 year after termination. So here's our example. Let's say somebody was hired September of 2020 and they left 6 months later, March of 2021. If you look at 3 years total from the date they're hired, that would be in 2023, right? 9/15/2023. 1 year beyond employment would be March of 2022. So you look at that and you say, okay, which is longer? And then you would have to keep that form until September 15th, 2023, right? It's figure out a system, but we used to look at this monthly is preferable, but look at it quarterly at the very least. Just come up with a system for flagging it. And you're going to have to keep those files by when you can shred it, not like the date of termination, because it's going to be different for everybody, right? Because if you've been employed for 5 years and you leave, then you only have to keep it 1 more year. But if you hire someone and they leave right away, you're keeping it at least 3 years. All right. Nicole, this is a great time for people to audit their I-9s, right? We do this all the time. And of course, we're here to help you. If you want us to come in and audit, Curtis can audit, whoever. It's great to have a second set of eyes look at it, but this is a great time as you're going through this to take a look at all of your Form I-9s and figure out if you need to make any corrections at the same time. Let's go through these. Nicole, why don't you talk about common mistakes? We came up with these, and then Curtis, you might have some other ones you want to throw in.
Sure. So our team assists with many I-9 forms per week. So I feel like I'm seeing one almost every single day. And I get so excited when I see one perfectly completed, but sometimes that's not the case. So we tend to see these as the most common mistakes for sections 1 and 2. Before getting specifically within both sections, just in general, I've seen with relation to when each section must be completed, those have to have the specific date in which each section has to be dated. So for section 1, for example, it must be completed before or on the person's date of hire. Section 2 must be completed within 3 days of the person's start date. So just making sure you're staying in that compliance window to get each section out of the way. And then for section 1, these are just a few that I tend to kind of think about off the top of my head. But for the preparer translator box, it's a very small portion right under where someone signs in section 1 that tends to get missed more often than not. So just making sure that the appropriate box is checked. Also with the employee information, that portion within towards the top of the form in section 1, there is space where it's asking for the employee's information. So name, address, date of birth, social, but there are some fields that maybe do not apply to everyone, such as apartment number or other last names used if they change their name. So in those cases, when it does not apply, you must indicate on the form that that's the case. So what we recommend is having entered NA, which stands for not applicable, within each field that does not apply. It cannot have a line through it, can't be crossed out. We must show that it actually does not apply to the employee rather than just having a simple line crossed out. So that's very important to just keep in mind and double check once you have the I-9 uh, in front of you. Another big one I would say is the dates. So the I-9 is just very picky in terms of how the date nomenclature needs to be completed on the form. So this would include any sort of date, the date of birth, the signature date. It must have the full format as month, day, year, year. So if we use today as an example, I would have to put on the form 07/20/2023 to capture the full date. And those are just the main section 1 mistakes that I've tend to see pop up. For section 2, now this is the portion where the employer needs to complete. So, with the training that we hope that employers and managers have, just making sure that the full form is completed just within section 2 of page 2 of the I-9. So within section 2, there is a line at the very top that tends to get missed sometimes that asks for the employee's last name, first name, middle initial, and citizenship status. So those fields have to be completed based on exactly what the person completed in section 1, matching to the T. For the citizenship status, that last box, I've noticed that sometimes people tend to put US citizen, although that might be the case if they selected option number 1 under section 1, it has to have the number based off what the employee selected in section 1. So there are 4 options for your citizenship status. Based off what the employee selected, you have to put the number that's corresponding. So going back to the citizenship, that the person is a US citizen, in that example, that's option number 1. So number 1 would have to be in that field. Related more to kind of the documents, just making sure that the document information is entered in the correct columns, as someone can choose an item from list A or an item from list B and C. So just making sure those are entered in the appropriate places. Also with documents, as everyone knows, we cannot accept expired documents for completing an I-9 form, and they have to be from the list of acceptable documents. So just double checking on that. For the documents themselves, sometimes the issuing authority can be a little bit more obvious than others, but just making sure that you have the correct issuing authority listed when you're completing the document information. So for example, Social Security cards, you would think are all administered and sent out from the Social Security Administration. However, that's not the case. Some are sent out through the Department of Health and Human Services, some are through the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So just very important to just note that based off what is listed and what is presented on the document. Also, when employees are eager to start their first day, sometimes they may over-document and provide a bunch of documents that you weren't even asking for, but it's also very important just to explain that the documents that they present, you'll be able to use that. They necessarily don't need, let's say, a passport if they provided their social and their driver's license or vice versa. So just making sure that they do not over-document when you complete section 2. And lastly, the inconsistent document practices. This is closely tied to just making sure what your normal policy is when keeping I-9 forms and keeping document copies. So it is very important to kind of teach and practice that all or nothing rule, where if you keep a document copy for one, it must be for all. Or if you don't keep any documents at all, keep it as is. Don't keep any copies laying around. So just make sure to keep that consistency when storing your I-9 forms.
Curtis, do you recommend to your clients that they keep copies of documents or they don't keep copies of documents? So I think if I asked 100 employment attorneys, 50 would say do it, 50 would say don't do it.
Yeah, I typically recommend not to keep a copy. I think it's just easier and cleaner that way.
Yeah, and so as an HR professional, we always like to keep the copies because I know
Mm.
like when I was in-house, I might be onboarding a whole bunch of people the same day. And if I forget to take a copy of somebody or, I go back later, I'm like, darn it, like I missed that, I can't find, their information or they went out and started working on the floor or whatever. So I'm just always interested in knowing, because again, ask 100, you're going to get 50-50 on that one. Curtis, any common mistakes that we didn't talk about that you see or anything you want to emphasize for people?
And I've seen all of these mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, we see a lot more, but we just try to come up with sort of like the top 10 that, we see on a
Yeah.
regular basis.
And kind of like Nicole said, in all the I-9 audits I've done, I've never seen a perfectly completed I-9.
Me either.
It almost happened once, but then I got to the third box on section 2 and found a mistake.
Yeah.
I was excited. I was like, oh my gosh, it's finally going to happen. But it didn't.
Yeah, we've audited thousands and thousands. I mean, I probably over the history, of since this requirement started, maybe seen a handful, but it's rare. So, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. So let's talk about penalties, Curtis, because this is your expertise here, and this is the bad news, right? So what could happen if somebody comes in and does that audit?
Yeah, so the DHS does an audit and find mistake. The DHS can issue civil penalties for each mistake, and the penalties range from what we have here. We have the different ranges here on the slide, but the DHS is only has discretion in deciding how much of a penalty to assess, and if there's a few number of penalties, or if it's an employer that doesn't have a history of making mistakes or violating any laws, the DHS will usually, and if the employer cooperates, the DHS will use their discretion to issue penalties on the lower side. But if there's a lot of mistakes, if it's a frequent violator, or if it's a company that's not cooperating, then the DHS will issue penalties on the higher side. The key takeaway here is to not let the penalties pile up. Don't give the DHS excuses to issue you penalties. Try to do the I-9s correctly when you hire an employee. Do the rechecks that we're talking about in this webinar, and do the audits to try and have clean I-9s so that you can avoid these penalties. Because even though we've got some here that are like 272, 676. 472, the penalties stack up quickly and become a large number very easily. So I-9 is not an exciting topic, but it's an important area of compliance that each company needs to consider and maintain.
Yeah, and there's certain things that they can't cure anyway, right? So if you have a missing form, it wasn't filled out in a timely manner, you're going to go back and fill it out now. You may get dinged on it, but at least you tried to comply, right? So that's the good news. You don't want to ignore it or pretend like that person doesn't exist, right? Because they're going to ask you to run a report out of your payroll system with a list of all the employees and the hire date and term dates and all that kind of stuff. They can do that simple math to figure out if you should still have a form or not. So yeah, so thankfully, you know, all my years, I haven't been audited a lot. I have had that happen because I worked at a company as head of HR when we had government contracts. And so, you know, they're super picky, right? There's, you know, technical violations that are just like ding, 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 ding. And then there's more substantive violations. So you want to do everything you can to audit those now. So here's, you know, we don't know what the future is, but here's a little bit of good news. And when I talk about this, make sure you drop your questions in the Q&A because we have a few minutes left to answer those questions. So in 2021, toward the end of the year, there was a 60-day period where they solicited public comments about some proposed changes to the Form I-9. I know I went and we recommended a lot of people go and put in comments to ask them to make this a permanent situation where people could remotely verify Form I-9s. It is our new normal, right? Where people are working remotely. I think if anything, COVID proved to everybody, oh, work can get done if you work from home or you work someplace other than the company headquarters. So these are some of the things that they're considering. Who knows if and when this will ever come into play, but fingers crossed, right? So they're looking at some alternative ways to inspect documents. So it's not a physical inspection every time. They've talked about maybe a pilot program to do that. They're also looking at making changes to the I-9 form itself, and hopefully we'll get that form released sometime in the next few months. And then one of the things they're talking about doing is, okay, well, maybe that we, we would have people that sort of like an approved, like you've been trained and you have the stamp of approval that you're now allowed to do like the remote inspection, right? So there's different things that they're considering, and time will tell whether or not they're going to approve this for everybody, but fingers crossed. And Denise, thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Curtis, for that. Hang tight while we hear the questions. But I see that there's some Q&A. I have my little red box there. I don't know what is being asked, though.
All right, let's start. Can an employer fill out page 1 on Form I-9 to make sure it is done correctly?
Nicole, you want to take that?
Yes, so the answer is no. It has to be completed by the employee.
So there is you can have a preparer though, right?
Yes.
So we have this come up. I'm going to change the facts a little bit. Like one of the weird things I find about the Form I-9 is there is a Spanish version, but you're not allowed to use it in the US. You can only use it in Puerto Rico. I don't understand why, right? But we do have Spanish speaking employees that come in. So they might find it difficult sometimes to understand the language or fill out the form. You can help them fill it out, right? You can technically prepare it for them, but then that's when that box at the bottom comes into play. As Nicole mentioned earlier, you have to say either I was the translator that helped them do this, or I actually prepared the form for them. But the requirement is page 1 is completed by the employee.
Okay, so if section 1 was incorrectly completed, should they purge and redo the form or just use section 3 to re-verify?
Neither.
There's always
Neither.
a good answer to these questions.
No, it's a great question because this does happen, right? You go back and do the audit and you look at page 1 and you're like, they wrote the date wrong, or they didn't check this box or whatever. You cannot do it for them. So what you would have to do is pull that employee in and then have them make the corrections. And there's really specific ways that you have to correct all these forms, and we don't have time to go through it, but I'll just use date as an example because Nicole and I talk about this all the time. The dates are always written wrong. People just write, 7/20/23 instead of writing out, all of the digits. So let's say somebody did that, or another one that they do sometimes is they write their date of hire, or they sign with their birth date as opposed to like the date that they got hired or something like that. So what they would have to do is actually line through the information that's incorrect, initial it, Like they write in the correct information, initial it, and then date it with the same nomenclature, right? The 07/20/2023. So it gets sort of messy and complicated. They should do it with a different colored pen. So usually we suggest red or green, where they're going to go through, line through the wrong information, write in the correct information, and then initial and date it using the right nomenclature.
Okay, I love that Nicole mentioned earlier about the over information. Don't provide too much information on the forms.
We see it all the time where all 3 columns are filled out, or they bring a passport, driver's license, and social security card in, and the employer uses, the passport, but attaches copies of all 3 documents. So that's probably one of the reasons Curtis says don't take documents, because that's illegal. And so that'll get you fined. They consider, the over documentation is an issue, and you have to think about it this way. These are all red flags to DHS that you're discriminating against people, because we've also seen it like, well, I just take copies of permanent resident cards, or I just take copies of Hispanic employees' information, or whatever it is, right? Can't do it. It's a huge red flag to them.
Great. If an employee does not comply with the physical inspection requirement, is it the employer's responsibility to terminate the employee?
Curtis?
It is. So if an employee is not cooperating in this recheck process, then the employer has the burden of not employing somebody who has not been verified to work in the United States.
Yeah, it's not optional, unfortunately. You can wait till August 30th. You could tell people, hey, you have till Friday to bring it in, and if they don't, you fire them, or you give them until August 30th. But at August 30th, if somebody comes in and inspects you and you haven't done the physical inspection, you're going to get fined for it. And if you're employing somebody, because Nicole mentioned they want to see continuity, right? If you're employing somebody and you can't legally, verify that they're legally employable in the United States, you're going to get a hefty penalty on that one.
Okay, great. A question on E-Verify. So we have a person who's writing in today that says that currently they don't use E-Verify, but they want to start. Do they need to submit E-Verify for all current employees, or can we just start with the new hires moving forward?
Nicole, do you know? Because I think they just start with the new hires moving forward, but I'm not positive.
Right, that's what I was leaning towards, but that's a great question.
That is correct. When
okay.
you start using E-Verify, you start going forward with your new hires. And I'll chime in with my own opinion. If you're in California, don't use E-Verify.
Okay, why do you say that, Curtis?
It just makes the hiring process more complicated. It's not required to use it. So
unless you have government contracts. Certain government contractors have to.
Yeah,
but
certain
other than that,
government contractors are required to do it, but if you're not required to do it, then I wouldn't do it.
I know we've talked to a few like restaurant clients that are worried, about, falsified documents and things like that. So they've talked about doing it for that purpose, right? Just to make sure they're not going to hire somebody, because there's good forgeries out there too. It's hard on the surface sometimes to tell a forged document. We've gotten pretty good at it because we've seen some bad forgeries, but yeah.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about timing, because there's quite a few questions on timing,
Okay.
how long they have to keep I-9s. Since the retention period is 3 years total, does it mean that I-9s older than 3 years do not require physical inspection?
I don't know that I follow that.
Yeah, I think it's an incomplete question, because it
Okay.
depends if the employee's been terminated or not.
Right.
Okay, so if the person wants to enter it, we'll try to get to it. If not, then you can have the information. You can follow up
we
with.
can break it down into a couple of scenarios, right? So one is, if the first thing you're going to do is make your list of all of your employees that you remotely inspected, the next thing you should do is take out all of the terminated people, because you're not going to be able to physically inspect their documents, right? You're not going to go to their home and say, hey, you left 2 years ago, but I need your documents, right? So you're going to make a note in that additional information field, is what Nicole was saying, and say the physical inspection could not occur because the person separated employment on this date, and then initial it or sign and put your title depending on if you were the original person or not. That's a separate issue. The document retention policy is separate. You're still going to have to retain that document if it's not long enough to shred, right? So in my example here, this employee left in March of 2021, right? You wouldn't be able to physically inspect the document, so you would make that note, but that doesn't mean you shred it. You keep it, right, until the greater of 3 years total or 1 year beyond termination. So hopefully that answered the question for whoever asked it. And if not, reach out and we can talk about it.
Okay. Let me just check on okay, so here's a question. You talked a little bit about it earlier, but if people move to another geographic region, does the employee need to come to the office to verify the Form I-9? If yes, who pays for the transportation costs? That's a good one.
Yeah, Nicole, go ahead.
So if the person moves to a completely different location, we kind of go back to having that authorized representative option where someone can ask anyone, neighbor, friend, roommate, to complete that verification in order to get it done and comply with the I-9 updates. Now, I believe if they want the person to travel and meet the person and have the employee meet them in person, that would be really a company decision at that point, whether they want to incur that reimbursement or decide whether they want to pay that employee for the travel out there. But they always have the option of using an authorized representative to get that completed.
Yeah, but the burden of any cost is going to be on the employer. You can't tell your employee, oh, you need to fly out to California so I can verify your I-9. Sorry, even if, I know, because a lot of employers go, well, but it was their choice to leave. It was their choice to move to Wyoming. It's like, yeah, but that's how it works. Sorry,
We have a question about what if a terminated employee in calendar year 2023 was hired 10 years ago, and during the onboarding process, they never completed an I-9 form? Does the company have to go to the terminated employee and require them to complete the form post-termination?
No, and you're probably not going to have any luck doing that, right? If the employee's been gone. So no, that's one of those situations where you're going to attach a memo explaining what happened. You could just say, memo to file, right? And on this day, we completed an audit of our I-9 forms, or during the month of June or July or whatever it is, we completed an audit of our I-9 forms, and we determined that this was never completed properly 10 years ago upon hire. We just now found out the person's left. We can't complete it now, and you just attach it. So at least you're acknowledging, oops, we made a mistake, right? So they come in, you're still going to be busted, you're still going to be fined, but at least you're trying to comply with the rules.
Okay, here's a question from a new employee at a company. Can they change the consistency of keeping or not keeping the copies? Do we have to denote the change anywhere? Someone is new to their company and they don't agree with the decision not to keep copies. I guess they're trying to cover themselves there.
I'll jump in here, and then Curtis, I'd be interested in knowing what your thought is. So we always recommend that you keep the I-9 forms in binders, right? Separate from the employee files. So for something like that, that's sort of a global change, we would put a memo at the beginning of the notebook and make, the same thing, memo to file. On this day, we made the decision to change this practice, and going forward, we're going to be doing this. And then as long as you're consistent going forward from that standpoint, you shouldn't have a problem. The problem is, again, from a potentially discrimination situation where you're being inconsistent in how you're doing it, but you can change your practice, right? Curtis, you want to jump in on that?
Do 100%.
Okay. You're cutting out a little bit just when you start talking. So you said you agree?
Yeah, I agree with you
Okay.
entirely on that one.
Well, then by all means, repeat that a few times. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, here's a question. Does a new hire have to fill out a new I-9 if they are a
Sorry about that.
rehire? Say that again?
I said sorry about that because
Okay.
I was looking for that page and somehow took it out. But start again, sorry.
All right, start over. Does a new hire have to fill out a new I-9 if they are a rehire and their previous I-9 is still in date? And I'm not sure what in date actually means because I'm not an HR professional, so.
Yeah, there's a section 3 where you can re-verify people. I think it's 3 years, but I don't know off the top of my head. Do either one of you know? If the person is rehired within a certain amount of time, then you can use the original form and you would just fill out section 3, but is it 3 years? I think it's within 3 years.
I believe it is 3 years.
Yeah, we
Yes.
just have to look it up.
Not sure about the time period, but yeah, you do section 3 to re-verify.
Okay. Okay, can we do one last question real quick? I don't know how the timing
Yes.
is, guys. Okay.
We're good.
So you spoke about fraudulent IDs, and so someone asked a question, how do they determine if something is fraudulent?
Well, the good news is that on the surface, I mean, the rule is that you have to, like, on the surface, it has to appear to be legit, right? I will tell you, we got really, really good when we did an audit for a manufacturer here in Santa Ana, where we saw so many fraudulent permanent resident cards. It was ridiculous. The best thing I can suggest, if you go to the USCIS website, or if you download, and I'll put it in the chat here, if you download it's called the M274 Handbook for Employers. I'm going to just type it in. I think this is exactly how it's titled. If you download that, they actually have examples of documents, right? So it'll give you, because like they just changed the permanent resident card again. Now I think it's going to be, is it pink now, I think, Nicole? I mean, they just changed it again. So sometimes what you have to do is you have to look at it and you have to go, okay, this card says it was issued on this date. And then you have to go back and look, okay, what's the version of the permanent resident card they're using? That's where we see the most fraudulent cards, in my experience anyway. I haven't ever come across like a fraudulent passport or driver's license. I've seen a couple fraudulent social security cards. Those are pretty, easier to forge than other things. But that's what we would use. Is you can go on the website, they do have photos and you can take a look that way, or in this handbook gives you a lot of really good information and they update it from time to time. Any advice you guys have beyond that?
Well, the only thing I would say from a legal perspective is you can't, you're supposed to, under California law, you're supposed to accept the identification card or document if it looks correct. You're not allowed to do any kind of like background check or any kind of additional investigation into whether the card is real. If the card looks correct based on the guidelines and the instructions, California law requires you to accept it.
Yeah, so like what we would see is on the permanent resident card, at different times, the picture may be like facing forward, or it may be a shot to the side like this, but we would see a card that was issued on a date where it was supposed to be like a full, frontal photo, and we would see a side shot or something like that. Or on the back, the number you actually put on the form, would have 3 letters with it, followed by, I think it's 13 digits, whatever it is, and we would see the wrong number of digits. Right. So that one, those are easier to spot. But again, if on the surface it appears to be legit, then you just take it. So.
Okay,
All
great.
right, we're a little bit past 12, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. I really appreciate everybody attending today. We did put, we don't have a topic yet for our next webinar, so if you have any ideas for that, please let us know. Also, you'll get a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the survey. Please fill that out for us. If you need HRCI credit, at the end, it will direct you to a page where you can download the certificate. But please, please, please suggest topics, because we love to do the webinars, but after a while we run out of ideas. So help us out. And then just finally, also, this is in the slides, we're not going to talk about it much. We do offer different services, one of which is conducting I-9 audit. So if you ever need any HR support, recruiting, training, or payroll processing, I hope you'll reach out to us. Denise, thank you as always for moderating. Nicole, you knocked it out of the park. Thank you so much for being our subject matter expert. And Curtis, it's always a pleasure. Appreciate having our legal authority here with us. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good rest of the day.